Hi everyone, and welcome to another HOI4 modding lesson on the Iron Workshop. It sure is great to say that again. In this lesson, we'll be learning about the nudge tool, one of the most controversial, if not hated, tools in HOI4 modding. But I have to say that once you get used to the quirks of the nudge tool, it becomes much easier to work with. So let's start the lesson and see how we can improve our work using the nudge tool. Let's go. Alright, so what are we going to learn in this lesson? First of all, I will provide a broad explanation of what the nudge tool is. Second, I will explain how to access the nudge tool. You will need to be in debug mode in order to use the nudge tool. Third, I will talk about general use rules. The nudge tool can be very frustrating if you don't know how to use it and exactly how it functions. Once you understand how it works, it takes out a lot of the frustration when using this tool. And finally, we're going to go over each function of the nudge tool, and I will talk briefly about each function, what it does, and how you can use it. Let's begin. Alright, so let's talk briefly about what the nudge tool is. The nudge tool is used by the developers and modders to make changes to the game map. Both visual and database changes can be done using the nudge tool. Although the nudge tool can help you save a lot of time, it is recommended you double check that all the required changes done by the tool have been done correctly. If not, fix them manually first and then proceed to making the next changes. It is highly recommended that you work in steps when using the nudge tool. Finish your first task and then proceed to the next. Lastly, the tool is a bit unstable and can often crash. Now, I will be giving a quick explanation on how you can avoid one of the most common crashes when using the nudge tool, but in other cases it is very much possible that even if you did everything correctly and everything right, the tool will still crash. Don't worry about it, just go back to the tool and continue where you stopped. In order to start using the nudge tool, you will need to have the nudge option available in your main menu. In order to have this function available in your main menu, you will need to run the game in debug mode. Now, if you're watching this video, it is highly likely that you already are in debug mode and that you know how to access the nudge, but I will still give these instructions in case you're new to the tool. I have a separate video on how to start the game in debug mode, so go ahead and watch that if you don't know how to do that. Once you are in debug mode, start the game, click on nudge, and you're inside the nudge tool. That is it. Okay, now let's talk about general nudge tool usage. As I said at the start of the video, if you don't understand how the nudge tool works, it can be very frustrating using it. So let's go through the basics of how the nudge tool functions and what it does when you're using one of its functions. Alright, so let's assume that I go to states and I want to create a new state. So let's go ahead and do this. I will create a new state in here. I will name it just test, and I will click on create state. And this is true for every function of the nudge tool. Once I've done this, what happens is that the nudge tool creates the data for this new state, not in the base game, not in the folder of your mod, but in the documents folder of your game. This is why sometimes when you're making map changes, even if you uninstall and reinstall the game still crashes or gives you errors because those files have not been altered. When you uninstall the game, it only removes the game files from the Steam folder. So let's go ahead and find where these changes are. So I'm going to open the folder. The folder is located in Documents, Paradox Interactive, HOI4, and in here you'll see that I have a folder called Map, Localization, and History. These folders were not here before I created this new state. If I go to Map, you'll see that it created a folder called Strategic Regions, and it edited an existing strategic region with the new state that I created. Let's go back. If I go to the Localization folder, you see that it created a localization file with the name of the new state that I created. And if we go to History, States, you see that there are two files here. The reason for that is because the game moved the provinces from the original state to the new state that I created here, state 807. Now the nudge tool automatically assigns the new state the next number. For those of you who have been doing state modding, you know that your state ID numbers need to be in a certain pattern, and the new state always has to have the last number. So in the vanilla game, the next state that I will be creating, if I did not create any other state, is 807. Alright, so these files are here, but they're not in my mod, which means that I need to grab these files and put them in my mod in order to see the changes next time I open the nudge tool. And this is one of those things that is not properly explained and that creates a lot of frustration, because once you do these changes and you want to create new and additional changes, you don't see them because the game hasn't realized that the new changes have been applied to your mod. So I know that it's a bit confusing, but the bottom line is that any function you use in the nudge tool, once it makes the changes, you need to grab the changes from here and copy them over to your mod. And this is why it's a good idea to work gradually. If you created a new state, then focus on that state, finish that state with all the provinces that you need, and only then move to the next state, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of files that might get mixed up and things might not work properly, and you won't know where to start debugging and finding the issues, some of which can be created by the nudge tool itself. So the bottom line of this section of the lesson is that whenever you make a change through the nudge tool, the change will be placed in the Documents Paradox Interactive HOI4 folder, not in the base game, not in the folder of your mod, and you need to grab these files that were changed and move them over to your mod. Alright, so now that we are done with the general use information, let's go over the various nudge tool functions and see what they do. The first function we're going to be talking about is the states function. So once you click on states, the nudge tool shows you all the existing states in the game, and you can do various actions for each of these states. So for example, if I click here, this tool comes up and it allows me to do a couple of things. First of all, I can rename the state just like I did here. This state is now called test. I can also change it to something else and click save, and then the name will be changed. A new localization file will be created in the documents folder, and you need to copy that file to your mod for the changes to take effect in your mod. Alright, the next thing that we have here is the following: delete all empty. This will delete any state that doesn't have any provinces. Now, usually you would not have a situation where you have states that don't have any provinces, but in case that happens, you can click this button and it will remove these states. Next, there's a button called Find Collision. What this button is useful for is for finding states that share a common province. So, for example, I have this state in here, and it is possible that this state might have a province that is also assigned to another state, usually a neighboring state. This can happen when you're doing province or state modifications or changes. So accidentally one state can end up being into, one province can end up being in two states, and obviously that is not a good situation. Now, usually you would get an error in the error log, and the nudge tool will let you know beforehand. But in case you want to find all the possible issues that you might have, you can click this button, and you see that the nudge tool now panned to this state in here, and it showed me that in this state there's a province 575 that belongs to both this state and this state here, and I can fix this situation just by clicking the correct state that the province should be assigned to. So once I do that, it will fix it in the files. I can click on save, and that should take care of that issue. Again, for the fix to be applied in your mod, you will need to copy the relevant files from the document folder over to your mod. Next, we have a function called open file. So once I click on a certain state and I click open file, it will open your default text editor, and you can edit the file itself from here. Now please note that when you click on open file, it copies the file to the documents folder. It does not allow you to edit the file directly in the vanilla game or in your mod. It copies the file, so again the file will have to return either to the base game or to your mod for the changes to take effect. Next we have delete state, and obviously with this button you can delete states. Be careful when using this function because there are some things that are related to states like strategic regions and supply areas that aren't always updated. So use this button carefully. After each state you delete, it's best to restart the game, make sure there are no errors, there are no problems, and only then proceed to deleting your next state or making any other changes. I have a separate video on how to create new states by using the notch tool, but in this lesson I will go briefly on how you can do this when you're using the tool. So a lot of people, when they start the notch tool, they're not sure, how do I create a new state? So in order to do that, you need to highlight your first province that you want to be part of the new state. You need to hold the shift key on your keyboard. And what this does is that it takes out that province out of the existing state. You then click the province again. This here thing comes up. Here you need to give your new state a name. So for example, let's call it test2. And you need to click on create state. After you've done that, you can click on save, and that will create the corresponding files in the documents folder. Now, if you want to provide your new state with additional provinces, what you can do is to click on the state, hold the shift key, and while you do that, just click on the additional provinces that you want to be part of your new state, and that will give these provinces to the new state. Click on save, and it is possible that once you click on save, it will revert back to how the state was. So it will look like all of these new provinces were taken away from the state. But that is not actually the case, and you'll see that once you copy the files over from the documents folder to your mod, the new state will have all the new provinces that you've assigned to it. Now let's proceed to the supply areas function and see what we can do there. The next function we're going to talk about is the supply areas. With this function, you can create new supply areas, and creating new supply areas is very similar to how you create new states. Now, if I were to click here, you see that I get some information about this supply area. Now, supply areas work with states, not individual provinces. So if I click here, we see that the supply area is 21. If I hover here, we see that it's 22, but in here it's 20, in here it's also 20. So supply areas, especially if we were to open the file, you see that they have states in them, unlike states that if we were to open a state file, you see that they work with provinces. So if I want to create a new supply area, I can just click a state that is already assigned to one of these supply areas, hold the shift key, it goes blank, although that's a bit hard to see, but trust me, it does. And when you click again, you have the options to create a new supply area. You can give it its base value, and you need to click on create region, click on save, and your new supply area will be created. Now, it's important to note that usually the notch tool transfers all the relevant states from one supply area to your new supply area, but sometimes it doesn't, which is why it is best to be careful and create your supply areas one by one. Make sure that your new supply area has the required states in the file, and if it doesn't, just open the file and add those states in, their state numbers, and remove them from the old supply area. And only once everything is correct and done properly, proceed to the next supply area. Alright, now let's move on to strategic regions. Creating new strategic regions is quite straightforward. We click on strategic regions and it shows us all the existing ones in the game. Now, one interesting thing with this function is that it also allows you to change the type of naval terrain. So for example, if I click on this strategic region here, the English channel, I have this naval terrain function in here, and I can actually change its designation by clicking on these naval terrain buttons. And once I do that, I just need to click on save, and now the English channel will have its new naval terrain, which is very handy and quite comfortable, the fact that you can change it from here. Now, if I want to create a new strategic region, I just click on a state that is part of an existing one. I hold the Shift key on the keyboard that unassigns this state from the strategic region. I click on it again. Now this thing shows up in here. I need to give it a name. Let's call it just test 5, whatever. I'll click on create region. Now it's created. And now I can assign new states to this strategic region by holding the Shift key and just expanding it as much as I wish and clicking on save. Now, if we open the file, you'll see that strategic regions work with provinces and not states. And this is quite important because in the nudge tool, as you have seen, by expanding the strategic region, it actually grabs states. So it's important to make sure that all the provinces that are part of that state are in the strategic region. And I wish I had some good news here, but unfortunately that's not the case. Oftentimes the nudge tool will not assign the provinces correctly, or it will move the provinces for the strategic region, but it will not make the changes for the states. And that tends to create all kinds of problems. So just like with all the other functions in the nudge tool, I recommend extreme caution. If you're creating a new strategic region, do it step by step. Create your new strategic region, make sure there are no errors. If there are any provinces that need to move from the existing one to the new strategic region, go ahead and do that. There's no problem if you open the files directly and you move the provinces IDs from one file to another in order to fix these things. This is how I do it all the time whenever I do map editing. It is unfortunately part of the process, and the nudge tool doesn't always get it right. So once everything is in place and is proper, then you can proceed to make your making an additional strategic region, but it's best not to try and create a lot of these at once, especially if you're new to this and you haven't done a lot of these things. Another important thing to note about strategic regions. So for example, if I open the file for this strategic region, you see that it's quite empty, and it's especially empty in the weather department. So if I open an existing file like this one in here, you see that weather has a lot of information. And unfortunately, again, the nudge tool will not fill this information for you. And for newcomers, it can be quite confusing, like, okay, what do I put in here? For me personally, what I found to be the best solution is, since the strategic region is usually cut off from an existing one, I just take the weather information from the existing one, so from the opening bracket to the closing bracket of the weather, and I just copy it over to my new strategic region like that, and then that strategic region also has weather information for it. Now this is quite important because when you're playing the game, if the strategic region doesn't have any weather assigned to it, then various modifiers, terrain modifiers will not be applied, like rain, mud, and all of those things, and obviously there won't be any kind of effects on units that are fighting in the strategic region, which is a big problem. So make sure that you copy over the weather and that your new strategic region has weather information, because the nudge tool will not transfer this information for you. So that is all I have to say about strategic regions. Let's move on to ambient objects. Alright, now let's take a look at ambient objects. Now I specifically loaded a mod and not the vanilla game, since it will be much easier for me to show ambient objects this way. So once you click on ambient objects, and if you click anywhere where an ambient object doesn't exist, it won't really show you much. But if we were to go to New Vegas and I were to click on the lucky 38, you see that it shows me information about this object. So ambient objects are used to place 3D models on the world map that are static. This is not like buildings which can change, can be removed or added. These are always on the map no matter what. Now in here you can change the scale of the model. For example, I can change this to something like 5. I can save it, and now you see it's much larger, right? So you can do a lot of interesting manipulations with this. And of course, in order to show these models, you need to first import into the game. Now, I'll be totally honest, this is a part of map modding that I do not have any experience with, but in case you want to make changes to something that already exists, then you can do this with the Ambient Objects function of the notch tool. Alright, now let's talk about database. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the database function of the notch tool. So the database function deals specifically with the definition.csv file that exists inside of the map folder. This function only deals with information that is located in that file only. And there are a couple of interesting things in here. First of all, I do want to mention that it is possible that once you click on database, your notch tool may crash. Now there are a couple of reasons why this could happen, but I also found out that this could happen even if everything is correct with your map information. Now one way that you can overcome this is by opening your definition file. So for example, in here I'm in the vanilla game and I have the definition.csv file. So I can open this file. All you need to do is to make some kind of a change to this file. You don't actually need to make any change at all, just make sure that the file has been changed in a way. So for example, I can change this here from false to true, save the file, and then just go back and change it to false again. Change the file, save the file, and once you've done that and you have the notch tool open at the same time, once you click on database or you click any of these functions, it will no longer crash. This is a fix that I found out about while doing some map modding, so hopefully this will help you. Now let's go over the functions of the database and what we can do with it. First of all, we have a button here called Generate RGB. What is this button for? Let's go back to the definition file. Each province in the game is recognized by the game by assigning it a unique color. And this color is assigned to the province with a color code. And there are 3 codes for red, green, and blue. And if we take a look here at this first entry, you see that this is the first province. This is the value of the red value, as we said, RGB, red, green, blue. This is the value of the green value. This is the value of the green code, G, and this is the value of the blue code, B. So you need all of these 3 color codes in order to put a new province into the game. Now I have a separate video on creating new provinces, so you can watch that video and learn how to do that. So I won't go in depth in here how to do this, but the function of this button here is to give you an available code, a free code that isn't already used by a province. Because once again, if we look over this file, you see that we have a lot of provinces even in the vanilla game. So it is possible that the RGB code that you want to use is already taken up by the game. And this button generates a new code for you that you can use that is not already in use. And that can obviously prevent conflicts with other provinces that already exist. Alright, next we have type. So once I click this, it shows me the type of province. So this is shown by land, sea, and lake. And this defines which type of type each province is, and I can change it accordingly. So obviously if my province is a land province, I can mark it as a land province and paint it. I will explain about painting in a moment. If it's a sea province, then I can click on sea and paint it as a sea province. And of course, if it's a lake, which means a type of sea that is not connected to the oceans, then I can mark it as a lake. Now, what happens here is that once I click on land and I click on one of the provinces, it will edit the definition file of my mod or of the vanilla game, depending on what you're changing, and it will mark it as a land province. Now, this is quite important in order to define where certain buildings can be built, where certain units can go or not go. So this is what the type function does. Next we have coastal. So if I click on that, it will show me all the coastal provinces in the game. Now in here we are already encountering a bug in the nudge tool because the coastal provinces were supposed to show up once I click it, but probably because I already played with some of these functions, it doesn't work. So all I need to do is to leave the nudge, reopen it again, go to database, coastal. Alright, and now it shows me all the provinces that are marked as coastal provinces. And this is another important function. So coastal provinces are provinces where you can build ports and naval bases. Provinces that are not coastal should not have that option. And if we take a look at this mod, we see that there's quite a lot of provinces that are marked as coastal provinces, although they're not. And this is something that you can encounter quite a bit if you're making a lot of changes to the game map. And you can sometimes forget about editing the coastal or non-coastal areas, but the nudge tool can definitely help you make this change fast and in a visual way, because these things are also noted here in the file. We have these lines here that say true or false. So true is a province that is a coastal province. False is a province that is not a coastal province. But obviously it would be much more difficult for me to go for each province, and I don't really know where this province is located just by looking at the code in the game and deciding if it should be a coastal province or not. So I can use the nudge tool for that. So if I click on coastal and I click on a province, so for example here this province is marked as a coastal province. If I were to click on it, then it will mark it as a coastal province. If I right click on it, then it will unmark it and it will no longer be considered a coastal province. And once you're done doing that, you can click on save and it will resave the definition file. Alright, the next function is terrain, and terrain allows me to paint various types of terrains in the game. Now each province also has a definition of terrain. If we once again take a look at the definition file, you see that we have jungle, plains, desert. Now this is obviously the file for the vanilla game, not the mod that I am currently running, but the principle is the same. So for example, if I have this province in here that is currently defined as a hills province, I can change its designation by clicking on the appropriate terrain type, for example forest, and clicking on the province. Now you see here that the terrain changed to forest, and once I do all of these changes I can click on save. The nudge tool will save a new definition file to the documents folder, and I can just copy that file to my mod in order to show the changes. Alright, now let's talk about continents. So once I click here, you see that the nudge tool changes the outlook to show me each province and what continent it belongs to. I will remind you that it is possible that once you click it, it doesn't change, because once you play around with the nudge tool, it tends to get stuck, so it doesn't show you the new information. All you need to do is to leave nudge, re-enter nudge, and then click on the new function, and it should work properly. So in here we see that the mod developers have divided North America into various continents, and this is quite important both for AI calculations, where certain capitals are located and how the game treats them. So for example, if you're searching for a capital that is on a certain continent, while the capital is usually looked at on the state level, the function that looks for a capital actually takes into consideration the province, the victory point that is set on the province. So it is possible that this might create a confusion where you have a province that is located in Africa, but it is assigned to the European continent, and that can obviously create confusion. It also can create confusion for AI calculations, where it needs to assign various fronts and things like that. So it's quite important to make sure that your continent information is set and is correct. And this is something that can go missing when you're doing a lot of changes to the world map. You've created your new states, your new provinces, you've assigned them the correct terrain type, you've even assigned the coastal type, but you forgot to assign the continents, something that can definitely happen. So just make sure to change that. In order to assign a state to a new continent, I just click on the continent name and I click on the province. And you see that once I do this, the terrain, the continent of this province will change. Now, it is possible that the changes will not be immediately visible once you click save. You will need to exit nudge and then re-enter nudge to see the changes. And of course, if you're doing this in a mod, you will need to copy the definition file to your mod. Now, one last thing, I do want to take a look at the file itself, the definition.csv file, and where the information on the continents is located here. And in here you see that we have these numbers, 6, 2, 4. These are the numbers that are assigned to continents. So instead of guessing the number and making sure that each province has its correct number, you can just use the nudge tool to correct this information, which is obviously much easier. Alright, now let's take a look at the last function, show colors. Now again, this is something that doesn't work because I will need to leave the nudge tool, re-enter, go to database, click on show colors. Now this shows me the colors of the various provinces in order to make it easier for me to identify them in case I need to do some changes on the map files themselves or on the graphical provinces file. So it's quite handy, it can definitely be helpful, and you can use this function. Alright, so we're done with the database. Now let's move on to weather. The weather function allows us to change the weather in regards to the strategic regions. When I talked about strategic regions, I mentioned that when you create a new strategic region, the game doesn't create its weather patterns and weather information. So you will need to copy that information from an existing one. Now, obviously, if you want to make changes to that, it can be easier to do using the nudge tool. So for example, if I click here, this is a strategic region, I can assign various types of weather to this region. So for example, I can decide that this region will have rain, or it will have snow, and you see that it starts snowing here, or a blizzard. And this can really help you fine-tune the weather in the various strategic regions that you create. And of course, you can play with the information here that will determine what times of the year this weather will apply, how common it is, and so on and so forth. I won't go into too much detail here. This is something that you just need to play around with and experiment. Before I talk about the buildings function of the nudge tool, I want us to take a look at a quite common error that comes up concerning buildings and how we can use the buildings function to fix this error. So I have created my new state here in France. Currently it's not assigned to any country, but that's really not the main issue. If I open the error log, we will see that I have this error here that says map buildings blah 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 blah, a lot of buildings ignored problems. So why is this happening? What happens is that when you create a new state, and especially when you split this new state from an existing one, the game confuses about the positions of buildings. So buildings are placed on a state level, and that means that the game distributes the buildings to the various provinces in the state. And once you've taken some of these provinces, because you've created a new state, the game no longer knows where to position these buildings, and that is why you get that error. So now let's see how we can fix this error quite simply using the nudge tool. So I'm going to exit to the main menu. I'm going to go to the nudge tool, click on buildings, and I'm going to fix the buildings for both of these states. First of all, you see here that the new state doesn't have any buildings at all because there is no entry in the buildings.txt file telling it where to position the buildings. So you can fix that quite easily by clicking on the state and then clicking on random in state. And that will create a random position for all the types of buildings that exist in the game or in your mod for this particular state, which is very handy. Now, most of the time it does it quite nicely and quite correct, but sometimes you will see that ports have some weird locations, so you can play around and actually fix individual buildings and how they are positioned in a state. So to change the position, I need to click on the building that I want to change, for example, naval base or air base. Let's go for naval base. In here you have instances. So this is the position of the building for each province. And right now we're focused on this building in here. And I can rotate this building and drag it around just by clicking the right mouse button and dragging it around the edges of the state of the province, And of course this will stick to the edge of the province because this is a coastal building and it's meant to be on the coast. And I can also rotate the building by holding the control key on my keyboard and using the mouse wheel. And that way I can change the position at which the building is facing just like that. And of course, once you have all of these things finished, you can click on save and the game will create a new entry for the positions of buildings. Now, positions for buildings are not saved in individual files. There is one huge gigantic file called buildings.txt and you just need to copy that file from the documents folder to your mod, but it is very important to apply the fix for all the states involved. So that means that if I created this state out of this state, then I also need to change the buildings for this state. Because if I don't do that, then the game will still attempt to place buildings in these provinces because it thinks that these provinces are part of this state. Now, one additional function that you have in here is random in all states, and that means that you can regenerate buildings for all the states at once. And this is usually a good idea to do if you're creating a whole new map, and obviously you don't want to go through each individual state and set its buildings. But if you're just doing some minor modifications to the map, it's usually not a good idea to use random in all states, because some states obviously have buildings that are positioned in a way that is more logical than what a random assignment might be. So it's best to use the random in state. Alright, so that is all for buildings. Now let's talk about units. The units function in the nudge tool allows you to edit and create new unit positions in the game. So for example here I'll show you a small change that I did. If I were to click here, you see that these units are not centered properly in the state. And this is something that can happen when you make changes to provinces. So in order to fix this, I can click on the province and then click on Auto in Province. And this will realign all the unit stacks in this province. Now I can change individual units positions. So for example, if I were to click here, you see that it highlighted this unit here in red. And by right clicking, I can drag the unit around and change its position. And I can also hold the control key and use the mouse wheel to change its position as well. And this is obviously a much more comfortable way of doing this rather than editing the file responsible for it, which is unitstacks.txt. Another thing that you can change in this function is the location of the capital star. So any state that has a victory point, that victory point will have an indication for it, and if it's a capital, then it will have a star. And you can change where this star or victory point indicator is located by going to victory point, and you see here that I now have this red thing in here, And I can also move it around by right-clicking and positioning it exactly where I want it to be. The same thing can also be done with ships in case this is a coastal province. So I can change the location of ships in port, disembarking, if units are attacking, and so on and so forth. Once you apply these changes, click on Save. Now you can also do Auto in All, and that will reposition the units in all the provinces in the game. Now, oftentimes it can cause a crash in case you have some errors with your provinces, but if all of your provinces are done properly, then it should not crash. And that is all we have to say about the unit function in the nudge tool. Alright, so we've gone through all the functions that exist in the nudge tool. Now, I do have to say that I'm not an expert on these things, and I haven't really played with all of these functions at the same level. So some of them I used more, some of them I used less. So if you have insights or if you have comments about anything that I said in this video, you're more than welcome to leave it in the comments below and let us all know new information if you have it. Also, if you have a question or if something wasn't clear, please leave those questions in the comments and I will do my best to help you. If you liked this video and if it was helpful for you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel to be notified on new videos, and I will see you in the next modding lesson on the Iron Workshop. Bye bye.